You should sit with the staff tonight. It will be easier. Natalie said it without looking at me, one hand resting on the seating chart outside the ballroom, while the other adjusted the cuff of her navy evening jacket. For a second, I thought I had misunderstood. We had arrived together. Married 20 years. Same invitation. Same hotel. Same Sterling Crest leadership gala. Yet my wife was pointing toward a table near the back of the room, almost 30 feet from the executive section where her name had been placed beside senior vice presidents, board members, and the chief executive officer. I looked at her. Easier for who? She exhaled quietly and lowered her voice. Michael, please. This is an important night for me. The executive table is mostly leadership and board guests. You will be more comfortable over there. More comfortable. That was the word she chose. Not appropriate. Not necessary. Comfortable. The kind of word people use when they want a decision to sound considerate. I followed her finger across the ballroom. Table 12. Executive assistants, facilities staff, information technology support, event coordinators. Good people, from what I could see. People doing real work. People Natalie apparently believed belonged in a different category from the ones drinking champagne beneath the chandeliers. I was not insulted by the staff table. I was insulted by what she believed placing me there would accomplish. She wanted the room to understand that I was not part of her professional world. I looked toward the head table. Edward Lawson, Sterling Crest's chief executive officer, was laughing with two directors. Rebecca Hayes was reviewing the printed program. And beside Chairman Thomas Whitaker sat one empty chair. No jacket draped over it. No glass touched. No guest waiting nearby. Just an untouched place sitting beside the most powerful seat in the room. Thomas looked up at exactly the wrong moment. His eyes found mine from across the ballroom. The smile on his face disappeared. Then he looked at Natalie. Then at the table she had chosen for me. He understood immediately. I gave him a slight shake of my head. Not now. Thomas had known me for 11 years. He knew Bennett Ridge Holdings controlled Sterling Crest through its majority voting position. He knew I had personally asked him to become chairman 3 years earlier. More importantly, he knew I had requested no formal introduction that evening. I wanted to observe the gala before the company announced its next expansion proposal. Natalie knew Bennett Ridge was my investment firm. What she had never bothered to understand was how large it had become, or how deeply Sterling Crest sat inside it. She touched my arm and asked if we were okay. I looked at the staff table, then back at my wife. Of course, I said. I walked across the ballroom, pulled out an ordinary chair, and sat down beside a facilities supervisor named Gary, who immediately introduced himself and offered me the breadbasket. Behind him, 30 feet away, the chairman of Sterling Crest was still staring at me. And beside Thomas, the owner's seat remained empty. Gary turned out to be the facilities supervisor for Sterling Crest's Charlotte headquarters, and within 5 minutes I knew more about his work than Natalie probably expected me to learn all evening. He had been with the company for 17 years, knew every mechanical room in the building, and could tell when an air handler was failing just by the sound it made through a ceiling vent. Beside him sat Melissa, an executive assistant who coordinated 3 senior vice presidents, and across from me was Aaron from information technology support, who had spent most of the afternoon fixing the wireless network before the gala started. They were easy people to talk to because none of them were performing. Nobody asked what car I drove. Nobody wanted to know which club I belonged to. Gary complained about the hotel coffee. Melissa laughed about an executive who had changed his dinner selection 4 times. Aaron told me the ballroom network had almost collapsed during sound check. Ordinary conversation. Honest conversation. I found myself relaxing in spite of everything. That was the irony Natalie had missed. There was nothing beneath me about sitting with staff. The problem was that she had used the table as a ranking system. She wanted distance between my chair and hers because she believed distance communicated importance. Every few minutes, I looked toward the executive section. Natalie was smiling beside Edward Lawson, leaning into conversations with board guests, completely in her element. Once our eyes met, she gave me a small approving smile, almost relieved that I had stayed where she put me. That hurt more than I expected. She was not worried that I was lonely. She was relieved I was invisible. Thomas Whitaker noticed too. I could see him watching from the head table whenever conversation around him slowed. Twice he started to rise. Twice I gave him the smallest shake of my head. I had asked for no formal introduction because Bennett Ridge was considering another major capital commitment to Sterling Crest, and I wanted to observe the company without executives changing their behavior around ownership. That request had seemed simple when I made it. Now it was becoming educational in ways I had not planned. A server placed dinner in front of us, and Gary thanked her by name. I noticed that because nobody at the executive table did. They were too busy discussing expansion plans, revenue targets, and which regional office might host next year's event. Melissa asked whether I worked for Sterling Crest too. I told her no, but I had been involved with the company for a long time. She smiled and said that explained why I looked familiar. Before I could answer, Edward stepped onto the small stage and tapped the microphone. The room quieted. Natalie turned toward him immediately. Edward welcomed everyone, praised senior leadership, and thanked the employees who had helped Sterling Crest deliver its strongest year in nearly a decade. Then he began recognizing partners who had supported the company's growth. Banks, suppliers, strategic advisors. Finally, he mentioned Bennett Ridge Holdings. Applause moved through the ballroom. Natalie clapped. So did almost everyone at her table. I stayed still for a second, listening to my own company being praised 30 feet away by people who had no idea its founder was sitting beside the facilities supervisor. Thomas did not clap immediately. He looked straight at me. Then Natalie followed his gaze. For the first time that evening, the relief disappeared from her face. Natalie held my gaze for only a second before turning back toward the stage, but I knew that look. Something had shifted. She had heard Bennett Ridge Holdings mentioned before, of course. She knew it was my investment company. What she had never understood was what the company had become. In her mind, Bennett Ridge still belonged to another chapter of our marriage, when I worked from a rented office with mismatched furniture and spent evenings studying financial statements at our kitchen table. Back then, she knew every deal because there were not many to know. She remembered the first warehouse investment, the small manufacturing company outside Greensboro, and the logistics business that nearly exhausted our savings before it finally turned around. Then the years moved faster. Bennett Ridge grew. My lifestyle did not. Most mornings, I was awake before 5:30, drinking black coffee while Charlotte was still dark. I drove an 8-year-old Ford pickup because it ran well and because replacing a useful truck for appearances had never made sense to me. My office sat in a quiet brick building 15 minutes from home. No marble lobby. No private elevator. No giant letters across the roof. People who visited usually expected something more impressive. I never cared. Behind those ordinary walls, we reviewed acquisitions, appointed directors, allocated capital, and managed controlling positions across manufacturing, logistics, industrial services, and technology companies. Some days I approved decisions involving more money before lunch than Natalie thought I managed in an entire year. Then I drove home and took the trash cans to the curb. That contrast used to make her laugh. Later, it seemed to embarrass her. She started asking why I still drove the pickup when other executives arrived in new luxury vehicles. She wondered why I did not attend more charity dinners or industry events. She suggested I needed a stronger public profile. I told her visibility and value were not the same thing. She called that old-fashioned. The strange part was that I never actually hid Bennett Ridge from her. Documents came to the house. Board packets sat on my desk. Attorneys called during dinner. I mentioned Sterling Crest more than once over the years. When we increased our position, I told her. When Thomas agreed to become chairman, I told her that too. She listened the way people listen to traffic outside a window. Present enough to hear it. Not interested enough to remember. Eventually, I stopped offering details. Silence became easier than watching my own life compete with her phone. That was my mistake. Hers came later. She filled the silence with assumptions. She assumed my business remained small because our house remained modest. She assumed flexibility meant I had fewer responsibilities. She assumed privacy meant there was nothing important to see. Sitting at table 12, I realized those assumptions had hardened into something worse. Judgment. Edward continued praising Bennett Ridge from the stage, calling the firm a disciplined long-term ownership partner that had supported Sterling Crest through difficult years. Gary leaned toward me and said whoever ran that company must know what they were doing. I smiled and told him they had made plenty of mistakes too. He laughed. Across the ballroom, Natalie was no longer smiling. Thomas had stopped watching the stage entirely. His attention remained fixed on me, and beside him, the untouched seat at the head table still waited. Edward continued speaking about Bennett Ridge as if the company were an institution rather than something I had built one difficult decision at a time. He thanked the firm for providing stability during Sterling Crest's restructuring years, supporting long-term investment instead of chasing quarterly applause, and backing the expansion proposal now under review. Then he used a phrase that finally made Natalie turn her head. Our controlling ownership partner. I saw her shoulders stiffen from 30 feet away. She knew Bennett Ridge had invested in Sterling Crest years earlier. What she apparently had never understood was that the investment had not remained small. Edward went on to explain that major capital commitments still required alignment with the controlling shareholder before moving forward. Several executives nodded as if this were ordinary information. For them, it was. They knew Bennett Ridge as a corporate name on reports, voting materials, and governance documents. Most had simply never met the person behind it. That distinction mattered. Thomas knew me. Rebecca Hayes knew who I was from board records and prior governance discussions. Sterling Crest's legal team certainly knew. Edward knew my name on paper, but we had never been formally introduced face to face. Natalie knew me better than anyone in the room, yet somehow she knew the least about what the name Bennett Ridge had come to mean. That was the strange geometry of the evening. The people closest to the business understood the ownership. The woman closest to me understood the history. Nobody except Thomas seemed to have connected both halves. Edward raised his glass toward the head table and thanked the ownership group for its confidence. People applauded again. Natalie did not. She was staring at me now. I could almost see her searching backward through years of conversations she had once treated as background noise. The larger Sterling Crest position. The governance changes. Thomas joining the board. The calls from attorneys after dinner. The weekends when I told her I had to review capital plans. Details she had heard without assembling them. Gary noticed her looking and leaned closer to me. Your wife works with those people, right? He asked. She does. He smiled. Must be a big night for her. I looked at Natalie. It is becoming one. Edward stepped away from the microphone as the room returned to conversation. Almost immediately, Natalie excused herself from her table. She did not come toward me. Instead, she crossed to Rebecca Hayes and said something quietly. Rebecca listened, then glanced in my direction. Her expression changed just enough to tell me Natalie had asked the wrong question. Rebecca answered briefly. Natalie looked toward Thomas next. He was already watching her. I could see the uncertainty growing in her face, but pride was still fighting it. She was not ready to walk across the ballroom and ask me directly. Not yet. Thomas reached for his water glass, then looked at the empty chair beside him. He touched the back of it once, almost absent-mindedly. Natalie followed his eyes. Her gaze moved from the chair to me, then back to the chair. For the first time that night, she seemed to understand that the empty seat was not waiting for someone who had failed to arrive. It was waiting for someone who was already in the room. The first company I ever bought into had one loading dock, 43 employees, and a roof that leaked every time a storm rolled through central North Carolina. It was an industrial parts supplier outside Greensboro, and when I first walked through the building 20 years earlier, the owner thought I was there to sell him insurance. I was 38 years old, carrying a legal pad, wearing a suit that cost less than the desk in his office, and trying to convince him that I could help save a business everyone else had already written off. Bennett Ridge did not exist then. Not really. There was only me, borrowed office space, a second-hand desk, and enough confidence to be dangerous if I got careless. The numbers were ugly. The company had too much debt, outdated equipment, and customers who were quietly moving orders elsewhere. But the people were good, the product still mattered, and the problems were fixable. I put nearly everything I had into that first deal. Then I spent 2 years learning what ownership actually meant. It was not giving speeches. It was not sitting at the best table. It was making payroll decisions on Thursday night when cash arrived Friday morning. It was telling a plant manager the truth when the truth was expensive. It was replacing machinery before it failed, keeping promises to customers, and accepting that responsibility did not become lighter just because nobody could see it. That company survived. Then it grew. Bennett Ridge grew with it. A logistics business in Tennessee came next. Then a specialty manufacturer in Ohio. Then an industrial services company in South Carolina. Each investment taught me something different, but the pattern remained the same. Buy carefully. Learn the business. Keep strong people. Fix what was broken. Stay longer than everyone expected. By the time Sterling Crest appeared on my desk 11 years earlier, Bennett Ridge was no longer a small investment shop. Sterling Crest had strong engineering, valuable customers, and leadership problems that were slowly damaging both. We started with a minority position. Then the company stumbled through 2 difficult years. Other investors wanted out. We bought more. When another institutional holder exited, we bought again. Piece by piece, quarter by quarter, Bennett Ridge became the controlling shareholder. There was no dramatic takeover announcement. No champagne. No photograph in a business magazine. Just filings, agreements, board changes, and years of disciplined capital. Natalie knew parts of that story. She knew I had invested in Sterling Crest. She knew the position had grown. What she never understood was where it ended. Somewhere along the way, she decided that because I still came home in the same pickup and still made coffee in the same kitchen, the business must have stayed roughly the same size too. Across the ballroom, Edward was still greeting guests as if nothing unusual had happened. Thomas was not. He understood exactly what Bennett Ridge had become because 3 years earlier I had asked him to help protect it. I had called him personally and said Sterling Crest needed a chairman strong enough to challenge management, not flatter it. He accepted. Natalie had been standing 10 feet from me when I made that call. She had asked who Thomas was. I told her. She nodded, looked back at her phone, and forgot. Sitting at the staff table that night, I finally understood how many years of my life had become background noise to the woman I married. Natalie had never been excluded from my business life. That was the part one needed to be honest about, even with myself. I had not built Bennett Ridge behind a locked door. For years, I came home and told her what I was working on. I talked about plants, acquisitions, debt structures, management teams, board changes, and the companies we believed were worth holding for decades. She used to ask questions. Good ones. When we were younger, she would sit across from me at the kitchen table and listen while I explained why one manufacturing company mattered more than another. She remembered names. She remembered problems. She even challenged me when she thought I was taking too much risk. Then her own career accelerated. Sterling Crest promoted her twice in 4 years. Her calendar filled with client dinners, strategy sessions, leadership retreats, and conferences. None of that was wrong. I was proud of her. The problem was quieter. Our conversations became shorter. When I told her Bennett Ridge had increased its position in Sterling Crest, she nodded while answering an email. When I said we were discussing changes to the board, she asked whether I had remembered to call the plumber. When I told her Thomas Whitaker had agreed to become chairman after months of conversations, she said, "That is great," without asking why I had been involved. I noticed. Then I stopped expecting anything different. That was where my responsibility began. I could have sat her down and said clearly that Bennett Ridge had become a controlling investment group with significant authority across several companies. I could have explained Sterling Crest in plain language and made certain she understood the scale. Instead, I told myself that if she wanted to know, she would ask. Pride can disguise itself as patience. Mine did. The less she asked, the less I explained. The less I explained, the easier it became for her assumptions to replace facts. She thought my quiet schedule meant my work was light. She thought the absence of public recognition meant the absence of achievement. She thought the old pickup meant I had never moved very far beyond the man she married 20 years earlier. In one sense, she was right. I still liked the same coffee. I still preferred work boots on Saturday mornings. I still believed a useful truck was better than an impressive one. What changed was everything she could not see from the driveway. The companies grew. The responsibility grew. The decisions became heavier. I kept speaking. She stopped listening. Eventually, I stopped speaking too. Across the ballroom, Natalie was now watching me with an expression I had not seen in years. Not embarrassment. Not yet. Confusion. She excused herself from Rebecca and crossed toward the bar, but her attention kept returning to Thomas, then to the empty chair beside him, then back to me. Gary was telling a story about a broken cooling system at headquarters when I saw Natalie finally make a decision. She straightened her shoulders and started walking toward table 12. For a moment, I thought she was coming to ask the question she should have asked years earlier. Then I saw her expression. She was not coming for an answer. She was coming to make sure I stayed where she had put me. Natalie stopped beside my chair and gave Gary a polite smile before looking down at me. "Can I talk to you for a second?" she asked. I stood, but she shook her head almost immediately. "Actually, it is fine. I just wanted to make sure you are comfortable here. The words were careful. Too careful. Gary glanced between us, then focused on his plate. I looked at Natalie and waited. She lowered her voice. There is going to be some networking after dinner. The chairman, the board, Edward, senior leadership. I need to be able to move around without worrying about where you are. There it was. Not concern. Management. Where I am. I asked. You know what I mean. I do not think I do. Her jaw tightened slightly. Michael, please do not come over to the executive tables tonight. This is important for me. For a moment, the ballroom seemed quieter than it was. Glasses still touched. Servers still moved. People still laughed 30 feet away. But the sentence settled between us with more weight than any of it. I looked toward the head table. Thomas was watching. Rebecca was too. Even Edward had begun to notice that something unusual was happening. Then I looked back at my wife. Are you worried I will embarrass you? I asked. Or that they will think I belong beside you? Natalie blinked. That was all. One small movement. But I saw the answer before she said anything. That is not fair. It is a question. You are making this bigger than it is. You asked your husband to sit at a different table so the room would understand something about your status. I am trying to understand what. Her expression hardened, but her voice stayed low. I worked very hard to get into these rooms. I know. You do not understand what it takes to be taken seriously here. I almost smiled at the irony, but there was nothing funny about it. Maybe I understand more than you think. She exhaled and glanced toward the executive section, checking who might be watching. That hurt most. Even now, she was measuring the room. This is exactly why I did not want this tonight, she said. I just need you to let me have one evening where I do not have to explain you. The words landed cleanly. No shouting. No cruelty in her tone. That made them worse. Explain me. As if I were an awkward detail in the life she wanted people to see. I looked at the woman I had loved for 20 years and realized the problem had grown beyond misunderstood investments or missed conversations. Natalie did not merely think my work was small. She had begun to think I was small. I sat back down. All right, I said. Relief crossed her face. She thought the conversation was over. Then a chair scraped across the ballroom floor. Natalie turned. So did Gary. So did half the people between us and the head table. Thomas Whitaker had stood up. He buttoned his jacket, stepped away from the chairman's place, and began walking directly toward table 12. Natalie went completely still. I did not move. Thomas crossed 30 feet of polished ballroom floor while conversations died behind him one by one. When he reached us, he ignored the empty chair beside Natalie and held out his hand to me. Michael, he said, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear. I have been wondering all evening why you are sitting over here. I shook his hand. Then I looked at my wife. Natalie thought this was the right table. Thomas kept his hand around mine for one extra second, not as a show of dominance, but because he was deciding how much to say in front of a room that had suddenly become interested in us. Natalie stood beside my chair without moving. Her expression had changed from irritation to uncertainty, and uncertainty did not sit comfortably on her. Thomas looked at her, then at Gary, Melissa, and Aaron, who were trying very hard not to appear as though they were listening. I see, Thomas said finally. 2 simple words. They carried more weight than a speech. Natalie straightened. Chairman Whitaker, I am sorry. I did not realize Michael knew you personally. Thomas looked back at me. Personally, he repeated. That is one way to describe it. I could feel conversations slowing at the surrounding tables. Edward Lawson had stopped speaking to one of the directors. Rebecca Hayes had turned fully in our direction. Natalie glanced toward them, and I watched her professional instincts take over. She smiled politely. Michael does some investing. I assumed you might have crossed paths through one of the firm's partners. Thomas did not embarrass her. That was important. He could have ended the mystery with one sentence. Instead, he studied her for a moment and asked, How much has Michael told you about his work? Natalie hesitated. Enough. Thomas looked at me. I said nothing. Then perhaps this evening has been more confusing than it needed to be, he said. Natalie turned toward me. Michael, what is he talking about? It was the first direct question she had asked me about Bennett Ridge in longer than I could remember. I wanted to answer. Part of me had wanted that question for years. But there, surrounded by employees and executives, it felt too late and too public. You should ask Thomas why he knows me, I said. Her eyes returned to the chairman. Thomas drew a slow breath. Michael and I have known each other for 11 years. 3 years ago, When Sterling Crest needed stronger, independent leadership on the board, he called me personally. Natalie stared at him. He called you. Several times. Why? Thomas gave her a look that was not cruel, only direct. Because my appointment mattered to him. Natalie looked at me again. Her face had gone very still. She was beginning to understand that this was larger than an investment account she had underestimated. Thomas turned toward the staff table and smiled at Gary and the others. I hope you will forgive me for taking him away. Gary raised both hands slightly. I think we can spare him. A few people laughed, softly this time. Not at me. The tension loosened for half a second. Then Thomas looked at Natalie and said, "There is a place for Michael at the head table. There has been all evening." Natalie swallowed. I thought that seat was for an ownership representative. Thomas nodded. It is. Silence returned immediately. I stood and buttoned my jacket. Thomas stepped beside me rather than ahead of me, and together we started across the ballroom. Natalie followed 2 steps behind. People watched us pass. Some recognized my name now. Others were simply trying to understand why the chairman had walked across the room to collect a man seated with staff. When we reached the head table, Edward stood automatically. Rebecca remained seated, watching Natalie more than me. Thomas stopped beside the untouched chair at his right hand. The place setting was still perfect. The glass had never been lifted. The folded card in front of it contained only one word: ownership. Thomas rested his hand on the back of the chair, looked at Natalie, and pulled it out for me. I did not sit immediately. I looked at the card, then at Thomas, then across the ballroom toward table 12. Gary was still watching. So were Melissa and Aaron. For a strange second, I wanted to go back and finish dinner with them. That table had treated me better in 20 minutes than some people in the executive section had treated employees for years. Edward stepped forward with the practiced smile of a man trying to solve a problem before anyone noticed he was confused. "Michael, good to finally meet you," he said. "I did not realize Bennett Ridge had sent someone tonight." Someone. I watched Thomas lower his eyes for half a second. Rebecca noticed too. Natalie stood behind me, silent now. "They did," I said. Edward extended his hand. "Well, we appreciate the support. I assume you are here representing the ownership group on the expansion review." In a manner of speaking. His smile tightened slightly. He knew my name. I could see him searching his memory. Michael Bennett had appeared in governance documents, voting disclosures, and legal correspondence over the years, but Sterling Crest was large enough that most senior executives dealt with Bennett Ridge through attorneys, analysts, and board channels. Edward had never needed my face. Until now. Rebecca leaned toward him and said quietly, "Edward." He glanced at her. She did not explain. She only looked at the card in front of my chair. Ownership. Then she looked at me. Recognition reached her first. Her posture changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. "Michael Bennett," she said. I nodded. Edward looked from Rebecca to Thomas. "Yes, I know the name." Thomas finally spoke. "Do you?" Edward gave a small, uncertain laugh. "Of course. Bennett Ridge Governance Materials." I just did not connect. He stopped. The unfinished sentence hung there. Natalie stepped closer. "Connect what?" Nobody answered immediately. That silence was harder on her than any accusation would have been. I could see years of half-heard conversations beginning to rearrange themselves in her mind. Bennett Ridge. Sterling Crest. Thomas. Board appointments. Capital decisions. My late-night calls. The weekends I spent reviewing numbers she assumed belonged to small investments. She looked at the chair again. "Michael," she said, almost under her breath. "Why does that card say ownership?" I pulled the chair back another inch, but still did not sit. "Because that is how Thomas labeled it." "I can see that." Her voice was controlled, but barely. "I am asking why it is for you." Thomas rested both hands lightly on the back of his own chair. "Natalie, before I answer that, let me ask you something. What exactly do you believe Bennett Ridge Holdings is?" She looked at him, then at me. "Michael's investment firm. And Sterling Crest. One of its investments." Thomas nodded slowly. "That part is correct." Edward had stopped smiling. Rebecca folded her hands on the table. The nearest conversations had gone quiet again. Natalie took a breath. "Then what am I missing?" Thomas looked at me once, giving me the choice. I did not stop him. He turned back to Natalie. "You are missing the difference between owning shares in a company and controlling it." Her face changed. Thomas continued, calm and precise. "Bennett Ridge does not simply invest in Sterling Crest. It holds the controlling voting interest. Natalie stared at him. Then she looked at me. How much? I answered this time. Enough to appoint the board when necessary. Enough to approve major ownership decisions. Enough that Thomas called me before he accepted this job. Her eyes stayed on mine. And Bennett Ridge belongs to you. I could have softened it. I did not. I control Bennett Ridge. Behind us, the ballroom felt very far away. Thomas pulled the chair out fully and said the words Natalie had spent the entire evening making impossible to misunderstand. Michael is not here as a guest of ownership. Michael is the owner you have been waiting for. For several seconds, Natalie did not speak. She looked at Thomas, then Edward, then Rebecca, as if one of them might correct what had just been said. Nobody did. The ballroom around us had become quiet in layers. The nearest tables were silent first. Then the people behind them noticed. Conversations faded. Glasses stopped moving. Even the servers seemed to sense that something important had shifted at the head table. Natalie looked back at me. You own Sterling Crest? She asked. Her voice was softer now. Bennett Ridge controls Sterling Crest, I said. And I control Bennett Ridge. She stared at me as if the distinction somehow made the answer larger instead of smaller. Edward cleared his throat. Michael, I apologize. If I had understood who you were earlier, I would have personally made certain that your seating was handled correctly. I looked at him. That sentence told me more than he probably intended. That is exactly the problem, Edward. His expression tightened. I am sorry. You are apologizing because you know who I am now. I glanced toward table 12. Gary was still sitting in the same chair. Melissa was quietly speaking to him. Aaron had returned his attention to the stage. Nothing about them had changed either. If I were just Natalie's husband, I continued, would the way I was treated tonight suddenly be acceptable? Edward did not answer. Natalie did. No. The word came quickly, almost painfully. I turned toward her. She looked shaken, but I was not interested in humiliation anymore. The reveal had already done enough. Then my ownership should not be the reason this feels wrong. She lowered her eyes. Thomas remained beside me, saying nothing. He understood that the most important part of the evening was no longer corporate. Natalie took a slow breath. Why did you let me do this? That question surprised me. Let you? You knew where that seat was. You knew what Thomas knew. You could have told me before I sent you across the room. I felt something cold settle behind my ribs. Natalie, I told you about Sterling Crest 11 years ago. I told you when Bennett Ridge increased its position. I told you when we gained control. I told you when Thomas joined the board. She opened her mouth, but I continued. You heard me. You just did not think any of it mattered enough to remember. Her face changed slowly. Confidence first, then defensiveness, then something quieter. Recognition. I thought you were still a minority investor, she said. I thought you advised them. I know. Why did you not correct me? Because after years of watching you stop listening, I stopped trying as hard to be heard. That was my failure, and I owned it. Silence can become a form of pride when a man convinces himself he should not have to explain his worth. I had done that. But my silence did not create the words Natalie had spoken that night. It did not choose the staff table. It did not make her say she did not want to explain me. Thomas finally pulled the chair back again. Michael, this place was reserved for you from the beginning. I looked at the empty seat. Then I looked at Natalie. Nothing about me changed in the last 10 minutes. Her eyes lifted to mine. I know. I sat down beside Thomas. Across the room, people were beginning to whisper. Edward reached for his water. Rebecca watched Natalie carefully. Natalie remained standing beside the table, surrounded by the people whose approval had mattered so much to her only an hour earlier. For the first time all evening, none of their titles seemed to help her. The strange thing about public embarrassment is that people often try to repair it publicly too. Within minutes, men and women who had barely looked at me earlier began finding reasons to approach the head table. One executive introduced himself twice. Another told me how much he admired Bennett Ridge's long-term investment philosophy, although I was fairly certain he had learned the phrase from Edward's speech 20 minutes earlier. A regional vice president asked whether he could bring me a different glass of wine. I declined. Nothing about their politeness was offensive by itself. What bothered me was the speed of it. I had moved 30 feet across a ballroom, and suddenly people believed I deserved more attention. Same suit, same face, same man, different chair. Natalie sat 2 places away from me after Rebecca quietly made room. She barely touched her dinner. Every few minutes, someone greeted me, and I could feel her becoming smaller beside the same people she had spent the evening trying to impress. I did not enjoy that. I had loved this woman for 2 decades. Watching her realize she had misjudged me was painful enough. I did not need an audience to make it worse. Edward leaned toward me when the next round of speeches began. Michael, I want you to know that whatever happened with the seating arrangement does not reflect Sterling Crest's values. I looked at him. You do not know that yet. He paused. Excuse me. You know it does not reflect the values you want Sterling Crest to claim. That is different. Rebecca glanced toward us. Thomas remained still, listening. I continued quietly. I spent most of dinner with employees who support this company every day. They were professional, generous, and more interested in doing their jobs than proving where they belonged. Then I watched senior leadership organize the room according to status and treat proximity to this table like a measure of human value. Edward's expression grew serious. Are you saying there is a culture problem? I am saying I came here because Bennett Ridge is reviewing Sterling Crest's next expansion proposal. Before we commit additional capital, I wanted to see the company when people were relaxed enough to behave naturally. Thomas folded his hands. He already knew why I was there. Edward did too now. Natalie finally looked at me. You were evaluating us tonight? Not you, I said. The company. Her eyes dropped again. I did not know what would happen. That mattered. I had not walked into the gala expecting to catch my wife doing something cruel. I had expected dinner, speeches, and a clearer sense of Sterling Crest's leadership culture. What happened between Natalie and me was personal. What I observed around it was not. Nobody is losing a job because my feelings were hurt, I said. Edward released a breath he had been holding. But Bennett Ridge will not approve a major expansion commitment simply because everyone in this room wants one. Rebecca nodded slowly. What do you want done? An independent review of leadership culture and governance practices before the capital decision moves forward. Employee interviews. Promotion patterns. Executive conduct. Whether disagreement is actually tolerated or merely described as welcome. Edward looked toward Thomas. Thomas answered before he could ask. That is reasonable. Natalie turned toward me. And me? I met her eyes. Anything involving your employment or performance will be handled without me. I will recuse myself completely. She seemed surprised. Maybe she had expected revenge. Maybe part of her thought power always worked that way. You are not going to protect me? She asked softly. No. I let the word settle. And I am not going to punish you either. For the first time that night, Natalie seemed to understand what authority looked like when it was not being used to win an argument. The room had spent hours deciding who mattered based on where they sat. I was about to find out whether the same habit had reached much deeper than the seating chart. The drive home took 23 minutes, and Natalie barely spoke for the first 22. Charlotte slid past the windows and ribbons of streetlight, while I kept both hands on the wheel and let the silence do what conversation could not. When we pulled into the driveway, she finally said, if Thomas had never walked across that room, I would have gone home believing I was right. I turned off the engine. That was the first thing she had said all night that mattered more than the reveal. Inside, we sat at the same kitchen table where Bennett Ridge had once existed as little more than paperwork, debt, and stubborn hope. Natalie removed her jacket and placed it over the back of a chair. Her phone stayed face down. I kept thinking the worst part was that I did not know what you owned, she said. It is not. I waited. Her eyes dropped to the table. The worst part is that I thought you deserved less respect when I believed you owned less. There was no defense left in her voice. No executive polish. Just recognition. That is the part one cannot forget, I said. She nodded slowly. Neither can I. The independent review began the following week. Rebecca Hayes led the committee with outside advisors, and I removed myself from every discussion involving Natalie's performance. Employee interviews reached across departments, from senior leadership to administrative staff, facilities, engineering, and regional operations. What they found was not corruption or some dramatic hidden scandal. It was something quieter and more believable. Sterling Crest had developed a culture where visibility was often rewarded faster than substance. Disagreement became dangerous when senior leaders felt challenged, and proximity to executives carried more social value than it should have. Edward accepted the findings without excuses. Thomas pushed for clearer promotion criteria, stronger employee feedback channels, and more independent oversight of leadership evaluations. Natalie was reviewed separately. Her performance record was strong. Her teams had delivered results, clients respected her work, and nobody suggested she had earned her position unfairly. But the Gala incident mattered because she had used a personal relationship in a professional setting to reinforce status distinctions. She received a formal reprimand and mandatory leadership coaching. She kept her job. I neither protected her nor pushed for more. That boundary mattered to both of us. At home, the harder review had no committee. Natalie started counseling on her own before I ever suggested it. She told me she needed to understand why recognition had become so important that she started measuring people through it. I told her I had work to do too. My silence had become a shield. I had convinced myself that refusing to explain anything was humility, when sometimes it was pride mixed with disappointment. Understanding that did not repair 20 years in one conversation. 3 weeks after the gala, I packed one suitcase. Natalie stood near the kitchen doorway while I folded shirts into it. "Are you leaving me?" she asked. "I am leaving the house for now." Her eyes filled, but she did not argue. "How long?" "I do not know." That answer hurt both of us because it was true. I rented a small apartment 12 miles away and took only what I needed. No dramatic goodbye. No threats. No promises. Before I left, I looked once at the chair across from Natalie. There was no place card on it. No title. No ownership label. Just an ordinary chair between two people who had finally stopped pretending they were fine. The apartment was quiet in a way our house had never been. At first, I mistook that quiet for peace. Then I realized peace does not wake you at 2 in the morning wondering whether the person you loved had changed, or whether you had simply stopped seeing each other clearly years earlier. I kept working. Bennett Ridge completed its review of Sterling Crest over the next several months. The expansion plan was revised, employee feedback became part of leadership evaluations, and Thomas strengthened the board's oversight of executive culture. Edward remained chief executive officer. Rebecca continued leading the governance work. Natalie stayed in her role and never once asked me to influence a decision for her. That mattered. She attended leadership coaching and private counseling every week. I knew because she told me, not because I checked. 3 months after I moved out, we started meeting every other Sunday at a small diner outside downtown Charlotte. No executives. No board members. No reserved tables. The first time we walked in, the waitress pointed toward the booths and said, "Sit anywhere you like." Natalie and I both stopped for half a second. Then she smiled. Not the polished smile she used at corporate events. A smaller one. Tired, almost embarrassed. We chose a booth near the window. For weeks, our conversations were careful. We talked about ordinary things first. Work, the house, my pickup needing new tires, her mother's birthday. Then, slowly, we started talking about what had actually happened between us. Natalie admitted that success had become less about doing meaningful work and more about being seen doing important work. She had started measuring people by titles because she was terrified other people were measuring her the same way. I admitted something too. My silence had not been entirely noble. Every time she stopped listening, I withdrew a little more. I told myself a strong man should not need recognition from his wife. That sounded dignified. Sometimes it was just avoidance. I had stopped asking to be understood because asking felt too vulnerable. 6 months after the gala, Natalie asked me whether I wanted to come home. I looked across the diner table at her. "Not to the marriage we had," I said. She nodded. "Neither do I." That answer stayed with me. A week later, I went to the house for dinner on a Friday evening. I parked the same old Ford in the driveway. Natalie opened the door before I knocked. She wore jeans and a simple sweater. No executive jacket. No event badge. No room full of people to impress. We ate at the kitchen table where Bennett Ridge had begun and where our marriage had nearly ended. There were no phones beside our plates. No paperwork. No labels on the chairs. After dinner, Natalie looked at me and said, "I used to think respect was something people earned by becoming important." I waited. Now I think respect is what you give someone before you know whether they are important. I reached across the table and took her hand. Not because everything was repaired. It was not. Not because one apology erased years of distance. It could not. I did it because she had changed in ways that did not require an audience, and I was learning to speak before silence became a wall. Thomas had not made me powerful by pulling out a chair. Bennett Ridge had not made me worthy by owning a company. And Natalie was not less worthy because she had failed me. We were two imperfect people deciding whether honesty could build something stronger than appearances ever had. We did not promise forever that night. We promised to keep showing up. And for the first time in years, neither of us needed a name card to know where we belonged.